There is a particular kind of cold that belongs only to the hours before dawn, when the world has not yet decided whether it means to soften or to hold. It is not the honest cold of deep winter, which announces itself without pretense and makes no apology for what it intends. It is something far subtler than that, and in its subtlety, something considerably crueler. It settles into old stone by degrees, creeping beneath ill-fitting doors and through the gaps that poverty and neglect have left unguarded, finding the places where warmth once lived and has long since been persuaded to give way. It is the cold of a house that has forgotten, or has been made to forget, what it means to shelter the people inside it. I have known that cold, not in the comfortable way of remembered things, with the soft edges of time smoothing what was once sharp. I have known it in the manner of a witness who has stood close enough to suffering to feel its particular temperature, and has found, to their lasting regret, that they could not always do what the occasion demanded of them. In all my long years of moving through the great and modest estates of this county, in drawing rooms and back stairways and stone-flagged kitchen passages where the true life of a household is conducted without ceremony or grace, I have watched many a good soul endure what no good soul ought to be made to endure. But I had never, in all those years, witnessed anything quite like what was done to Emmeline Hartwell on the night of the first frost of autumn. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Emmeline was 22 years old that October, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about her, not because of the number itself, but because of what 22 had come to mean in her particular circumstance. It was old enough to have known her father before illness took him, old enough to have understood and loved the life that Hartwell Grange had once been, the warmth of it, the particular dignity of a household managed by a man who believed that a home ought to reflect the character of the people living in it, rather than the reverse. And it was young enough that the loss of that life, which had come so swiftly and so completely in the 2 years since Lord Edmund Hartwell had been laid beneath the old yew trees in the churchyard at the edge of the village, still had the power to arrive at unexpected moments with the full and breathtaking force of something not yet fully absorbed. Her father had been, by every account that was not motivated by envy or social condescension, an excellent man, not remarkable in the way of those who set out to distinguish themselves in the eyes of the world. He had wanted no particular distinction. He had wanted, so far as anyone who knew him could determine, to manage his land well, to be honest in his dealings, to laugh with his tenants as often as they gave him occasion to, and to love his daughter with the wholehearted, uncomplicated devotion of a man who had found in fatherhood the one ambition worth pursuing. He had succeeded at all of it, very nearly until the end. He had made one mistake. It was not a small one, and it was not one that Emmeline, in her private and honest accounting, had ever been entirely able to dismiss, though she had tried and was trying still. 2 years before his death, at a point when his health had already begun its quiet decline and loneliness had begun to make itself felt in the Grange in the manner it always does in houses where only 2 people remain, he had married again. Her name had been Helena Forsyth before she became Lady Helena Hartwell. She was 40, the widow of a minor Cheshire gentleman whose estate had not survived the combined assault of bad investments and his own particular proclivities. She had 2 daughters of her own from that earlier marriage. Cecily, who was 24 and beautiful in the way of women entirely aware of their beauty and who regard it as a form of property to be managed and deployed with care. And Miranda, who was 20, and clever in the way of younger sisters who have grown up in the shadow of a more obvious quality and have compensated by learning to observe everything with great precision and say very little of what they see. Helena had been, in those early months of her marriage to Lord Edmund, everything that a second wife in an uncertain situation learns to be: attentive, warm in her manner, careful of the servants, and considerate of Emmeline, who had been 18 then and quietly watchful. She had won Lord Edmund's trust with the thoroughness of a campaign conducted at leisure, not dramatically, not with any single act of obvious calculation, but through the slow accumulation of small reliable gestures, the sort that are individually unremarkable and collectively decisive. She had won it so completely that when Lord Edmund's will was read in the cold library of Hartwell Grange on a December morning that Emmeline would never entirely forget, It contained provisions that reflected a trust given in full and not sufficiently examined. The estate was entailed and could not pass to Helena directly, but the management of it and the oversight of Emmeline's circumstances until she married or came into the small, independent legacy settled upon her at 25 had been placed entirely in Lady Helena's hands. Emmeline had stood in the library that morning and listened to the solicitor's careful voice reading words her father had put there from love and from a confidence in human nature that was, perhaps, the only thing she had ever wished he possessed in smaller measure. She had stood very still, her hands folded before her, her face composed, because she was her father's daughter in this above all things, that she did not allow what she felt to make itself visible until she had determined what she intended to do about it. And on that particular morning, what she felt was something she had not yet had sufficient experience to name, the cold and precise recognition that the life she had known was over, and that whatever came next would require from her everything she had. What came next was 2 years of careful diminishment, not dramatic, not performed with cruelty that announced itself boldly. Helena was far too intelligent for that. It proceeded in the manner of all the most effective cruelties, by degrees, with the particular patience of someone who understands that the slow method leaves fewer marks and invites fewer witnesses. Emmeline's rooms were reduced, first from the comfortable suite in the east wing, where she had always lived, to a single chamber on the floor above, on the grounds that the east wing required refurbishment the household budget could not currently allow. When the refurbishment came, it accommodated Cecily. Emmeline's chair at the head of the dinner table, which had been hers as daughter of the house, was quietly displaced by Helena's own. Her allowance was reduced on 2 separate occasions, each time with an explanation that was financially impeccable and morally hollow. Her access to the library was restricted by the simple method of rescheduling Cecily's music lessons to the adjoining room at precisely the hours Emmeline was most often found there, making the space unusable for quiet reading. Her presence at the local social occasions to which the family was invited was managed with a consistency that was remarkable only when viewed as a pattern. She was included in the invitations that did not matter and excluded from the ones that did. None of these things, individually, would have been sufficient to bring before a magistrate or even a drawing room. All of them together composed a portrait that was unmistakable to anyone looking at it honestly. Emmeline was being reduced, methodically and without hurry, from the daughter of Hartwell Grange to its poorest dependent, from the mistress of a household to a woman whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, whose voice was heard and disregarded rather than considered, whose future was being managed in the direction of nothing at all. She endured it with a grace that I believe only she was capable of sustaining, not through passivity. Emmeline Hartwell was not a passive woman. She had her father's intelligence and something besides, a quality that was harder to name, a capacity for the long view, an understanding that the present moment, however intolerable, was not the permanent condition, and that dignity, once surrendered, was extraordinarily difficult to recover. She kept her dignity. She said what needed to be said and declined to say what needed to be left unsaid, and made her small economies of spirit with the same precision that she made her small economies of the household's diminished resources, which she still managed, because Helena had found early, and to her evident irritation, that nobody managed them as well as Emmeline did. She also kept a garden. It was the only genuinely private thing still available to her, the walled kitchen garden on the eastern side of the Grange that had been her mother's before her, which predated Helena entirely, and which nobody wanted to use for anything else. She went there every morning before the household was properly awake, in the blue and silver light before sunrise, and she dug and planted and trained and cut back and tended with the wholehearted attention of someone who has found in one small corner of the world a space that belongs entirely to themselves. The garden was the place where she was most completely who she was, without performance or management or the careful architecture of composure. It was where she allowed herself to feel things fully, where she missed her father without discipline, where she permitted herself, occasionally and without apology, to be angry. She was not often angry, and she was never bitter. Bitterness was a thing she had watched enough of in other people to understand its particular cost, the way it consumed the one who carried it far more thoroughly than it ever troubled the one who had occasioned it. She was not going to give Helena the gift of her own destruction. She was going to be whole, and she was going to survive, and she was going to do it in full possession of the character that her father had raised her to possess, because that was the only real inheritance that had not been taken. The night of the first frost began without particular distinction. October had been moving steadily toward winter for a week, the mornings arriving colder than the one before, the light thinning in the way it does when the season has made its decision and is simply awaiting the calendar's confirmation. Emmeline had spent the day as she spent most of her days, quietly useful, attending to the accounts Helena was grateful to ignore, managing the household correspondence, and assisting Mrs. Pigott, the cook, with the autumn preserving. She had spoken to no one in particular and been spoken to in the same manner, which was ordinary enough. She had eaten her dinner in the back sitting room, as had become her custom, the dining room being given over in the evenings to Helena and her daughters and whatever company they chose to receive, and she had been in the process of retiring to her room when Cecily had appeared in the corridor with the expression she wore when she had prepared something and was pleased with the preparation. The vase was Chinese, blue and white, and it had stood on the hall table since Emmeline's mother had placed it there a generation ago. It lay in pieces on the flagstone floor when Emmeline arrived to find Cecily in apparent distress, Helena descending the staircase with the practiced urgency of a woman who had heard the crash from 2 floors up and arrived with her conclusions already formed. Emmeline had not been in the hall when it fell. She had been in the back sitting room, and Mrs. Pigott would have confirmed it without hesitation. What Mrs. Pigott was not asked, because Helena did not ask servants questions when the answers might prove inconvenient, and what Cecily's expression beneath its carefully arranged distress conveyed to Emmeline with perfect clarity and not a single word, was that the truth of the matter was entirely irrelevant to what was about to happen. Lady Helena's voice, when she addressed Emmeline in the hall with the pieces of the vase scattered between them on the cold stone, was neither loud nor particularly unkind in its surface quality. It was measured and regretful in the manner of someone whose patience, long extended, has at last and reluctantly reached its limit. She spoke of carelessness, of the irreplaceable nature of the object, of the particular sensitivity of a household where objects of value required a standard of care that certain members of the household had apparently failed to internalize. She spoke for 4 minutes without repeating herself. Then she informed Emmeline, with the quiet finality of a woman announcing a consequence rather than proposing a punishment, that given the current state of the spare rooms, which were in preparation for guests arriving the following week, Emmeline would find her accommodations for the evening in the stable block, where the old groom's room had been prepared. The old groom's room had not been prepared. What awaited Emmeline in the stable block, when she walked across the kitchen yard in the dark with her thin wool shawl pulled close and a single candle that the wind extinguished before she reached the stable door, was a corner space furnished with hay bales and old sacking, cold enough that her breath showed white in the dark air, and so comprehensively devoid of the basic elements of human comfort that she stood in the doorway for a moment, simply absorbing the reality of it. Then she went inside, because there was nowhere else to go, and she arranged what was available to her with the practical competence that was her governing instinct in all circumstances, and she sat down on the hay with her shawl around her shoulders and told herself, quietly and without the luxury of drama, that this was not the end of anything, that she would be warmer in an hour when her body had done its work. That morning came to stables as reliably as it came to anywhere else. She was asleep before the hour was out, not from peace and not from comfort, but from the specific exhaustion of a person who has been managing something very heavy for a very long time, and whose body, recognizing the temporary absence of witnesses, has simply taken the rest that was owed to it. His Grace Julian Ravenscroft, 4th Duke of Ravenscroft, was not a man who announced himself before he arrived. This was not discourtesy. It was rather the quality of a character so settled in its own nature that the ordinary requirement, which lesser men feel keenly, to prepare the world for their coming, had simply never presented itself to him as a requirement at all. He arrived when he arrived and departed when he had reason to depart, and the world adjusted itself to his presence with the efficient accommodation that the world extends to those rare individuals who have never required it to do anything else. He was 34 that October, which the London social world considered somewhat past the point at which a duke of his rank and fortune ought still to be unmarried, but which Julian himself regarded as an entirely unremarkable fact about his circumstances. He had not avoided marriage. He had simply found, in the 15 years since he had come into his title at 19 and assumed the full weight of the Ravenscroft responsibilities, that the demands of the dukedom and the demands of the parliamentary reform work to which he had quietly lent his considerable influence left very little room for the careful cultivation of a domestic future. There was also, though he did not dwell upon it, the matter of what he had observed of domestic futures in the great houses of England. He had seen enough of marriages built on convenience and calculation to have formed strong views about what he would and would not enter into, and those strong views had not yet encountered their sufficient reason to be revised. He was not an easy man to know. This was the honest assessment of those who had tried, and who had found the effort not unrewarding but genuinely demanding. He possessed a quality of complete self-containment that in a man of lesser intelligence might have been mistaken for coldness, and in Julian was simply the visible exterior of a mind that preferred to work through its conclusions before committing itself to them, and which had decided some time ago that most conversations were improved by the removal of everything that was not actually necessary. He listened with absolute attention. He spoke with complete precision. He did not perform warmth he did not feel, which meant that the warmth he did feel, when it was felt, carried a weight and sincerity that the performed variety never achieves. These qualities, unremarkable in a private person, were in a duke of his standing so unusual as to be quietly disorienting to those who had arrived expecting something else entirely. He was traveling to Aldenmere Park, the Derbyshire estate of Lord Grantham, an old friend and occasional ally in the parliamentary work, for a fortnight's visit. The journey had been long. He had left London in the early morning, and the October roads had conspired with the lateness of the hour and a broken wheel axle some 4 miles from the estate gates to ensure his arrival was well past midnight. He had sent word ahead 3 days prior. Lord Grantham would have arranged accordingly. What Julian had not arranged for was the state of his horse at the journey's end, and this, being the matter he considered most immediately his responsibility, was what drew him out of the house again after barely 10 minutes within it, lantern in hand, into the frozen dark of the stable yard. The stable block at Aldenmere was large and well-maintained, the horses settled into a quiet that spoke of a competent groom on the night watch. Julian moved along the stalls with the unhurried thoroughness of a man for whom this particular check was the habit of a lifetime, speaking softly to Hadrian, his gray gelding, who turned a reproachful eye in his direction before accepting the offered attention with the dignity appropriate to a horse who has had a long and frankly trying day. Satisfied with what he found, Julian lifted the lantern to leave. The light moved and fell on the corner. He went still. There was someone there, not in a stall, but in the far corner of the stable itself, on a pile of hay bales arranged with the evident care of someone attempting to make the best available situation into something approaching manageable. A figure small beneath a thin wool shawl, knees drawn up, head bent toward one shoulder, quite entirely asleep. The lantern light caught the curve of a cheek, dark hair escaping from its pins with the gentle disorder of sleep, hands folded against her chest, pale and still and cold. He did not move for a long moment. He stood and looked with the same quality of attention he gave everything, seeing the scene fully before drawing any conclusion from it. A young woman, asleep in a stable, in the first frost of October, in a gown that was decent but far too thin, with a shawl that was manifestly insufficient for the temperature that had settled into the stone and straw around her. A pair of worn boots near the base of the hay bale, one of them cracked at the leather near the toe, the kind of crack that lets in the cold with every step, and that a household with any reasonable means would not have permitted its youngest member to walk around in. He stood in the breathing quiet of the stable, and he felt something move through him that was not entirely nameable and was not mild. It was something between fury and a grief he could not account for, a recognition that arrived with the force of a thing seen so plainly that no social propriety can offer any adequate barrier against the simple and irreducible wrongness of it. A young woman, a stable, a frost night. The evidence of her arrangement of the hay bales told him she had not wandered here in confusion or chosen this as some eccentric preference. She had been put here, and she had done the best she could with what she had been left. He removed his coat. It was the coat he had worn for the journey, deep blue velvet, heavy and well-lined, the kind of coat built for exactly this quality of October night. He crossed the stable without a sound, moving with the deliberate care of someone who does not wish to wake what they are approaching. He laid the coat over her with a gentleness that had nothing performed about it, no gesture made for an audience, no calculation in it of any kind. He tucked the edge beneath her shoulder so that the cold rising from the stone below could not reach her from that angle. He adjusted it once, with the attention of a man who has decided that whatever he is doing is worth doing correctly. She stirred, not fully, not with the sudden alarm of someone woken by danger, but in the half-conscious way of a person whose body has registered a change in its immediate conditions, the warmth arriving like something remembered rather than new, welcomed before the mind is awake enough to question it. Her eyes opened the smallest fraction, dark eyes unfocused with sleep, looking up at him in the low lantern light with the expression of someone not yet certain whether the world they are returning to is the dreaming one or the waking. He did not move. He waited, holding the lantern at a low angle so that it did not strike her full in the face. She looked at him. He looked at her. For a moment that was not measured in seconds, but in something else entirely, some other unit that the ordinary world does not trouble to record, they regarded each other in the warm, animal quiet of the stable, with the horses breathing softly around them, and the October frost pressing close against the stone walls outside, and something passed between them that neither of them had any name for yet. "Sleep," he said. His voice was very quiet. Not a command. Something closer to a permission, the particular permission of someone telling another person that the present moment requires nothing of them, that the ordinary demands of the waking world have been, for now, suspended. Her eyes closed. She was asleep again almost before the word had finished. He stood a moment longer, looking at the face that the coat now warmed, at the dark hair and the folded hands and the small worn boot. Then he straightened, took up his lantern, and walked back across the stable in silence. At the door he paused and looked back once, at the small figure in the corner made warmer now by the weight of blue velvet, unknowing of the name of the man who had placed it there. Then he went out into the frost, and the stable door closed behind him, and the horses settled, and the night went on in its cold and patient way. And Emmeline Hartwell slept on, in the first genuine warmth she had known in longer than she would afterward choose to remember, beneath the coat of a duke whose face she had seen in the half-dark of a dream, whose name she did not yet know, and whose life, without either of their knowledge or consent, had already begun to turn toward hers in the quiet, irrevocable way of things that have decided to happen. Morning in a stable arrives without ceremony. There is no gradual brightening of the kind that reaches through bedroom curtains in a comfortable house, softening the transition from sleep to wakefulness with something approaching consideration for the person making the crossing. In a stable, the light simply appears, thin and gray through the gaps in old timber, accompanied by the particular sounds of horses beginning their day with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of animals who have never seen any reason to delay the morning. Emmeline woke to it. Not gradually, not with the slow, pleasant dissolution of a person emerging from genuinely restful sleep, but with the sudden and complete return to consciousness of someone who has, even in sleep, never entirely let go of the awareness that they are somewhere they should not be, and that the morning will demand something of them before it offers anything in return. She was warm. This was the first thing she registered, and it was wrong. And she lay still for a moment in the straw, trying to understand why it was wrong before her hands found the edge of the coat. Her fingers closed around the fabric slowly, feeling its weight and its quality in the particular way that the hands discover things before the mind has formulated a question. Heavy, dense, the kind of deep pile that spoke not merely of warmth, but of considerable expense. Velvet, she determined, pressing her thumb across the nap of it. Deep blue, she saw, when she lifted a fold of it into the thin morning light that was now coming properly through the gaps in the stable wall. Deep blue velvet with a silk lining the color of slate, and along the inner seam near the collar, in very small letters worked in thread a shade darker than the fabric itself, two letters that she examined for a long moment without immediately understanding what she was seeing. J.R. She sat up. She looked at the coat in her hands. She looked at the stable around her, quiet now in the early hour, the horses still, the straw undisturbed except in the particular corner she had occupied, which bore the shape of a person who had slept there and been, at some point in the night, made warmer than they had any right to expect to be. She stood. She shook the coat out carefully, the way one handles a thing that belongs to someone else, and that one has an obligation to return in exactly the condition in which it was received. She looked at it for another moment. Then she folded it over her arm with the precision she brought to everything, and she walked out of the stable into the cold gray morning, across the frost-stiff kitchen yard, and in through the back door of Hartwell Grange, before the household was awake, and before anyone who mattered to Helena had occasion to see where she was coming from. She put the coat in the chest at the foot of her narrow bed and closed the lid. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her fingers to her temples and thought. The coat was real. The letters were real. Some gentleman of means had been in those stables in the night and had seen her sleeping there, and had covered her with his own coat, and had gone away again without waking her, and the morning presented no ready explanation for any of it. She thought of the half-opened eyes and the dream edge of a face above her in the lantern light. She thought of the single word spoken in a voice that had been low and deliberate and entirely without condescension. She thought of it for a moment longer than was probably useful, and then she stood, because the morning would not wait for reflection, and went to see about the household fires. Helena said nothing about the previous night at breakfast. This was not surprising. Helena rarely revisited a punishment after it had been administered. The effectiveness of what she did lay precisely in its proceeding without acknowledgement, as though the events in question were simply the natural consequence of the behavior that had preceded them, requiring no further commentary. She sat at the head of the breakfast table with the composed pleasantness of a woman who has slept well in her own comfortable bed, and poured her tea with the untroubled hand of someone whose conscience is either genuinely clear or has made its peace with itself through methods Emmeline preferred not to examine too closely. Cecily did not look at Emmeline. Miranda looked at her once, briefly, with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite apology, and was, Emmeline had long ago determined, as close to either as Miranda ever allowed herself to come. Emmeline ate her toast, and said what was required and nothing beyond it, and went about the day. It was 3 days later that the invitation arrived from Aldermere Park. Lord Grantham was an old figure in the county, not a near neighbor by any strict measure, but Aldermere Park lay within the radius of those families that were considered part of the same social fabric as Hartwell Grange, and in the carefully maintained geography of Derbyshire society, that was sufficient reason for his invitations to be received and generally accepted. He was holding an informal gathering for a fortnight's guest, a man of some consequence, the invitation noted, from London and the southern counties. Nothing elaborate. A dinner, perhaps an evening of cards or music, the easy sociability of a country house in autumn with good company and no particular occasion beyond the pleasure of it. Helena read the invitation at the breakfast table, and Emmeline watched her read it, which was an education in itself. The first pass produced polite interest. The second produced something more alert. She looked up with the expression she wore when the social mathematics of a situation were presenting her with an arithmetic she had not previously considered. A guest of Lord Grantham's, she said, to no one in particular. Of some consequence. She set the invitation down and picked up her teacup and was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was thinking. Then she looked at Emmeline. "You will come, of course," she said. "It would look odd to exclude you, and I cannot have it looking odd." Emmeline received this in the manner she received most of Helena's pronouncements, without visible reaction, and returned to her tea. The invitation was for Friday. Friday was 3 days away. She thought of the coat in the chest at the foot of her bed and the 2 letters worked in dark thread, and she thought about the timing with the precise and careful attention she gave to any situation that might require managing, and she concluded that the probability of a connection was remote. Aldermere Park entertained a great deal. Lord Grantham was known for the quality and variety of his company. The guest of some consequence was almost certainly a different person entirely. She was not, as it transpired, correct. But she did not know that yet on the morning the invitation arrived, and so she went about the next 3 days with only the ordinary weight of ordinary things pressing on her, which was, by the standards of the preceding 2 years, something approaching lightness. Aldermere Park on a Friday evening in October was precisely what a well-managed country estate ought to be at that hour and that season. Fires in every receiving room. Candlelight on old silver. The smell of good wood smoke and the particular warmth of a house that has been lived in happily for a long time and retains in its walls and floors and proportions some residual quality of that happiness, available to those who come through the door with the receptivity to feel it. There were perhaps 20 guests when the Hartwell party arrived, gathered in the drawing room in the comfortable arrangements that evening gatherings of this kind produce, small groups that formed and dissolved and reformed as the room's social currents moved through them. Lady Grantham received Helena and her daughters with the gracious efficiency of a hostess who has assessed everyone in the room before dinner and knows precisely where each person fits. She received Emmeline with the same efficiency and the additional quality of a woman who notices more than she is expected to notice, and who had met Emmeline twice before under circumstances that had left her with a favorable impression she had not quite found an occasion to act upon. Emmeline thanked her and moved into the room and did the things that such occasions required her to do, which she did well, because she had been raised to do them, and because competence in social situations was one of the few qualities Helena had found it impossible to diminish. She spoke with the Reverend Aldous Farley and his wife about the autumn harvest and the recent improvement of the village road. She spoke with a young woman named Miss Partridge about a novel they had both apparently read, finding Miss Partridge's observations on it sharper than her appearance initially suggested. She accepted a glass of wine and stood near the window for a moment in the particular way she sometimes stood in social situations, present and composed, and also, beneath those surfaces, briefly, quietly, her own. It was in that moment, from that position near the window, that she saw him. He was across the room, in conversation with Lord Grantham himself, turned at 3/4 from where she stood. Tall, with the upright ease of a man for whom that posture was simply the way his body had decided to occupy space, and who had never given it particular thought. Dark hair, a coat of impeccable cut in a color so close to the deep blue velvet in the chest at the foot of her bed that her breath caught, softly and entirely without her permission, somewhere between her chest and her throat. He turned, not dramatically, not with any sense of having been alerted, simply turned, in the natural course of a conversation, in the direction that the conversation took him, and his eyes, moving across the room with the unhurried quality of someone taking stock of a space they are in without feeling the need to perform the activity, reached the window and stopped. He looked at her. She looked at him. The room continued around them in its warm and sociable way, entirely indifferent to the fact that something had happened in the space between the window and the far side of the drawing room that had nothing to do with any of the conversations currently proceeding, and everything to do with a cold stable and a lantern and a coat laid over sleeping shoulders in the dark. She looked away first. She looked at her wine glass, and then at the window, and then back at the room in general, and she managed all three transitions with a composure that she was simultaneously grateful for and aware was costing her a very great deal. Then she returned to Miss Partridge, who had been continuing her observations on the novel with the pleasant obliviousness of someone who had not noticed that her companion's attention had briefly and entirely departed the conversation. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She did not look at him again for 20 minutes. She was proud of the 20 minutes. It was the kind of discipline that she had been practicing in various forms for 2 years, and she had become, out of sheer necessity, very good at it. She circulated and conversed and was present to the social occasion with a thoroughness that would have satisfied the most demanding observer. When they were brought in to dinner, and she found herself at the middle of the long table, separated from him by 7 or 8 places and the width of the table's pleasant candle-filled center, she permitted herself a single quiet breath of something that was not quite relief. He was placed near Lord Grantham at the head, in the position of the evening's principal guest, which told her the rest of what the invitation had left unstated. A man of some consequence, the card had said, with the particular English understatement that is reserved for people of very great consequence indeed. She watched him across the candlelight in the way that one watches someone one has a reason to watch without being seen to watch, which is to say, in fragments, between the pieces of conversation that required her participation, assembling from those fragments an impression that confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. He spoke rarely at table, but when he spoke, people listened, not in the deferential way of those responding to rank, though rank was certainly present, but in the instinctive way of those who have recognized that the words, when they come, are worth attending to. He had a quality of attention toward whoever was speaking to him that she recognized from the stable without having been in any state at the time to properly identify it. The full, settled attention of a man who does not divide himself between the present conversation and whatever might be happening elsewhere. He was entirely where he was. She had seen this quality twice before in her life. Once in her father, and once, she thought, in no one. He found her after dinner, in the interval when the ladies had withdrawn and the men had not yet rejoined them, when the drawing-room had the slightly suspended quality of a room waiting for something. He came to stand beside her near the tall windows, not with the calculated approach of someone who has been planning the movement across the room, but with the naturalness of a man going exactly where he had decided to go. "Miss Hartwell," he said. She turned. He was closer than the room had led her to anticipate, which was to say, at a perfectly correct social distance, and no closer, but the particular quality of his presence made distance a more complicated calculation than usual. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was steady, and she was glad. He looked at her with that direct and level regard that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he looked at things he considered worth looking at. He did not announce himself. He did not make reference to the stable or the coat or any of the events of 3 nights prior, none of which would have been possible to reference with any elegance in a drawing-room full of people. He simply said, "I had not expected to encounter you here this evening." And then, as if the sentence were a question he had already answered in his own mind and was simply making available to her, he waited. "I had not expected to encounter you," she replied, and if the sentence contained a dimension beyond its literal meaning, they were both, she believed, equipped to notice it, and both, for the moment, agreed not to say so. "Lord Grantham tells me your family has been at Hartwell Grange for several generations," he said. "My father's family, yes. 3 generations of rather stubborn attachment to that particular piece of Derbyshire limestone." He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that was not the absence of a response, but the presence of someone absorbing what had been said more completely than the words on their surface required. "You manage the household," he said. It was offered not as a question, but as a plain observation, the way he stated the things he had already determined to be true. She looked at him. She wondered how he knew that, and then she thought about the kind of man who arrives at conclusions through evidence rather than assumption, and she decided to be honest, because dishonesty in the presence of someone paying that quality of attention struck her as a very considerable waste of both their time. "I manage the household accounts," she said, and a good deal else that falls under no convenient category. Something moved in his expression. Not pity. She would not have tolerated pity, and she suspected he understood this. It was something more considered than that. The look of a man who has received a piece of information and is placing it with precision alongside other pieces he has already gathered, forming a picture that he is not yet ready to name, but is seeing clearly. Helena appeared at Emmeline's elbow with the specific timing that Emmeline had long since come to recognize as the timing of a woman who has been watching and has decided that an intervention is required. She inserted herself into the conversation with the smooth social ease that was her most reliable weapon, offering Julian a smile of such calibrated warmth that Emmeline could see its mechanism even through its surface. "Your Grace," Helena said, "have you had occasion to speak with my daughter Cecily this evening? She has been so hoping for the opportunity to ask your opinion on the new railway proposals. She understands you have some influence in that quarter." Julian turned to regard Helena with the same direct attention he gave everything, and if he noticed the mechanism beneath the warmth, and Emmeline was quite certain that he did, he gave no sign of it. He was civil and brief, and turned with the particular unhurried finality of a man who has not finished his current conversation and does not intend to give it up for one he has not chosen. But Helena was practiced, and she had positioned Cecily cleverly, and within 2 minutes the social geometry of the room had accomplished what Helena intended, and Julian was obliged by the ordinary requirements of courtesy to give Cecily a portion of his attention, which Cecily received with the brilliant, calculated warmth of a woman who has been told that this particular opportunity matters and has prepared accordingly. Emmeline moved away. She did not look back. She found herself near the pianoforte. examining the sheet music arranged on its stand with the focused attention of a person who needs something for their eyes to do. And she was still engaged in this activity when Miss Partridge appeared beside her and offered a quiet observation about the evening that made Emmeline smile with genuine warmth and was, she reflected, one of the small and irreplaceable graces of an otherwise complicated occasion. She did not speak with him again that evening. The social currents did not bring them back together, and she did not seek him out, because seeking would have been noticed, and noticed things became materials in Helena's hands, and she had enough to manage without offering additional materials. She watched him from a careful distance for the remainder of the evening, as one watches a landscape that one is not certain one is permitted to enter, and she absorbed what she saw with the thoroughness she brought to everything. She saw him decline, twice, to be drawn into the kind of social performance that drew rooms of this kind performed upon their principal guests, the invitation to hold forth, to be impressive, to take up the large space that his rank made available to him. She saw him listen to an elderly gentleman on his left with the attention he would have given a statesman. She saw him say something quiet and precise at one point that made Lord Grantham throw his head back and laugh with the full and unsuspecting delight of a man caught genuinely off guard. She saw him look, once, across the room in her direction when he did not think she was observing, with an expression that she could not from that distance fully read, but that had in it a quality she recognized because she had been managing a version of it herself for the entire evening. She rode home in the carriage with Helena and Cecily and Miranda through the dark and frost-sharp Derbyshire night, and she looked at the black fields moving past the window, and she thought about a man who had come to a stable in the dark and covered a stranger with his own coat, and asked nothing and gone away again. And she thought about what such an act said about the character of the person who had performed it. And she thought about it for the length of the ride home with a precision and a thoroughness that she recognized, even as she engaged in it, was considerably more than the subject strictly required. Julian, for his part, sat in Lord Grantham's library that same evening, well after the guests had departed and the house had settled into its night quiet, with a glass of port he had barely touched and a fire he had been staring at for 20 minutes. And he turned over in his mind what he had observed at dinner with the systematic attention he brought to any situation he found himself not quite able to set aside. He had intended to stay in Derbyshire for a fortnight. He was already, at the end of his third day, aware that the fortnight was going to be insufficient for reasons he had not anticipated when he left London. He had a clear mind and a long habit of honesty with himself, and the honesty told him that the 3 days had produced 2 significant discoveries. The first was that the questions he had about Miss Hartwell's circumstances at Hartwell Grange were not questions that the fortnight was going to resolve by itself. The second was that the questions had become, in a very short span of time, the kind he could not put away and attend to later. He set down his port. He thought about a face in lantern light and hands folded against a thin shawl, and the particular quality of a composure so practiced it had become indistinguishable from the person wearing it, except to someone paying the right kind of attention. He thought about the way she had answered his questions at dinner, with the exact and honest economy of someone who has long since decided that there is no use in the elaborate defenses that other people maintain, and who has found in plain speaking a more efficient fortress than concealment ever built. He thought about the 2 letters worked in thread near the collar of a folded coat, and the fact that she had said nothing about the coat, and he had said nothing about the coat, and the fact that they had managed this mutual silence with a coordination that struck him, on reflection, as one of the more remarkable things he had witnessed in a good many years of observing people. He rose. He went to the writing table in the corner of the library, and he wrote a brief note to his secretary in London, requesting the extension of his Derbyshire stay by 1 additional week. Then he went to bed. He lay awake for a time, which was not his usual habit, staring at the ceiling of a comfortable room in an unfamiliar house, and thinking about nothing he intended to act upon and could not quite persuade himself to leave alone. It was Lord Grantham who told him, the following morning over breakfast, with the easy frankness of a man too long established in friendship to feel the need for diplomatic approach, the broader outline of the Hartwell situation. Not everything. Lord Grantham was not a man who trafficked in the particulars of other people's private difficulties, but enough. Enough that the picture Julian had been assembling from fragments since the night in the stable completed itself in the manner of something snapping into focus after a long and imprecise struggle. Lord Edmund Hartwell had been well regarded, Lord Grantham said, pouring his tea. A decent man. Left the daughter in rather a position, unfortunately, when he died. The second wife is well. He paused with the particular pause of a man choosing a word that is honest without being actionable. Efficient, he decided. Very efficient woman. Julian considered this. He had his own word for it, arrived at from more direct observation, but he did not offer it, because the occasion did not require it. What he said instead was, the estate management. Is it in order? Lord Grantham looked at him over the teapot with the mild, perceptive look of a man who has known him long enough to understand when a question is asking more than its surface suggests. Outwardly, he said. Inwardly, I could not say. There are things one hears and things one is not in a position to confirm. Julian nodded. He said nothing further on the subject. He attended to his breakfast with the focused composure of someone who has just finished a calculation and arrived at a number he does not particularly like, and who is now determining what he intends to do about it. He called at Hartwell Grange on Tuesday, not with announcement and not without, but with a calling card delivered the morning of, which was correct within the social conventions of the era, while leaving very little time for preparation by the household receiving it. He was admitted by a butler who managed the somewhat irregular timing with the professional dignity of a man who has been trained to receive whatever comes through the door with equal composure. He was shown to the drawing room. He waited. It was Helena who came first. She entered with the smooth efficiency of a woman who had spent the 20 minutes since the card arrived in rapid and productive preparation, and who was now composed and welcoming and precisely calibrated to the occasion. She offered him tea and the particular warmth of a hostess who has identified a visitor as being of significance and is bringing all her considerable skill to bear on the management of his impression. She was accomplished. Julian received her accomplishment with the civil neutrality that was his characteristic response to performances he had seen the mechanism of. He asked, after several minutes of appropriate preliminaries, whether Miss Hartwell was at home. Helena's pause before responding was brief, a quarter of a second at most, and she recovered from it with impressive facility, but it was there, and Julian had made a study of pauses. She is in the garden, I believe, Helena said, with the pleasant, slightly apologetic tone of a woman conveying information she considers mildly inconvenient. She tends it herself, you know, a particular hobby of hers. She smiled the smile of a woman who considers a garden a peculiarity in need of mild apology. I shall send someone. Julian set down his teacup. Please do not trouble yourself, he said, pleasantly, entirely finally. I am very fond of gardens. I shall find her. Helena's expression held its warmth with the strained perfection of someone maintaining a position that has just become significantly more difficult. Julian rose, inclined his head with the courteous completeness of someone for whom good manners are a discipline rather than a convenience, and went in the direction the butler had indicated, toward the east side of the house, where the walled garden was. The garden door was old iron set in old stone, and it opened onto a space that stopped him briefly in the entrance with the particular involuntary response that very good gardens sometimes produce in people who are paying attention. It was not large. It was not formal in the way of the great gardens of the great houses. It was, rather, the garden of a person who has been thinking carefully about it for a long time and has an intimate understanding of what grows well in this soil and this light and what does not, and who has made every decision with the dual purpose of usefulness and beauty and achieved both without apparent effort. Herbs in organized abundance along the south-facing wall. Espaliered fruit trees trained against the north stone with the patient precision of a project undertaken years ago and maintained faithfully since. Late roses still holding against the cold with the stubborn magnificence of things that know they are nearly finished and are determined not to be rushed. She was at the far end, crouching beside a raised bed with her back to him, her hands deep in the soil with the complete concentration of someone entirely absorbed in what they are doing. She had not heard the gate. He stood for a moment and looked at the garden and at the figure in it, and he thought, with the specific clarity that certain moments produce without warning, that he had never seen anything that looked more completely like a person in their right place. Miss Hartwell, he said. She turned. She rose. The movement from crouching to standing was accomplished with a natural ease that was also, he noted, a very rapid collection of composure. The reassembly of the surface she wore in the world over the interior she had just, for a few unguarded minutes, been entirely herself in. Her hands were soil-dark to the wrist. She did not apologize for this. She simply regarded him with those dark and careful eyes and waited. "I should not have come without more notice," he said. "No," she agreed. "You should not have." The agreement was direct and without apology, which he found he expected and was glad of. Then she added, "Though I confess I am not entirely surprised that you did." He looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I imagine you are not." A pause, brief, freighted. "I owe you a coat." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere above the south wall a blackbird was conducting its afternoon commentary on the state of the world, indifferent to the fact that the two people below it had just crossed a line that had been waiting for crossing since a cold night 3 days prior, and that the crossing of it had, in the way of these things, made everything that came after it a different kind of conversation than what had come before. She looked at him steadily. "It is in good condition," she said. "I folded it very carefully." He felt something he had not felt in a considerable time. Something warm and entirely genuine that arranged itself in the vicinity of a smile. "I did not doubt it for a moment," he said. "Miss Hartwell." He stopped himself and then said what he had come to say, because he was not a man who had learned the art of approaching things indirectly when the direct route was available. "What I witnessed 3 nights ago, in those stables, I want you to know that I do not intend to disregard it as though it were a thing I had not seen." She was quiet for a long moment. The blackbird concluded its observation and departed. The old stone wall held the last of the afternoon sun with the patient generosity of stone that has been absorbing warmth for 100 years and has learned to give it back slowly. "It is not a simple situation," she said at last. "No," he agreed. "I imagine it is not." He held her gaze. "Nor am I a simple man, Miss Hartwell, but I am a straightforward one. And what I saw on that night was a woman of evident quality and evident dignity being treated in a manner that I find wholly unacceptable." Her chin lifted, very slightly. It was not defiance. It was something older and less dramatic than defiance. It was the movement of someone who has been seen accurately for perhaps the first time in a very long while, and who does not quite know yet how to receive the experience without it costing them their composure. "You are very direct, Your Grace. I have found," he said, "that indirection costs more than it saves." She looked at her soil-darkened hands for a moment. Then she looked back at him with the expression she wore when she had decided to be honest, which he was coming to understand was her governing expression, the one she returned to when all the other options had been considered and found wanting. "What would you have me do with your directness?" she asked. "It is, as you note, not a simple situation. And I am not, whatever the evidence of 3 nights past might suggest, a woman in need of rescuing." "No," he said, and his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who means precisely what he says and nothing beyond it. "But you are, perhaps, a woman who has been managing alone for considerably longer than any person ought to manage alone, and I wonder whether the condition has become so familiar as to seem like the natural order of things, when it is not." The afternoon held them both in its October stillness. The garden was warm with stored sun and the smell of turned earth and the last herbs of the season, and it was exactly what it always was, the one private space that had remained entirely hers, and into which she was aware with a clarity that had nothing comfortable about it. She had now admitted something that could not easily be uninvited. She ought to have told him then about Helena, about the full and careful architecture of what had been constructed around her over 2 years, about the will and the accounts and the diminished rooms, and the precise and systematic removal of everything that constituted a life with any real shape to it. She did not tell him, not yet, not all of it, because she was not yet certain what he was, or what his directness would cost her if it were deployed in a direction she could not control. She had learned, at considerable expense, to be careful about who she trusted with the full truth of her circumstances, because the full truth, once given, could not be retrieved. What she did say was simply this: "I have managed," she said, "and I intend to go on managing. But I will not pretend that the company of someone who sees clearly is not, at this particular moment, a very considerable relief." It was, he thought, the most honest thing he had heard in a very long time. And something in him, the part that had been for 15 years deeply private about everything that mattered and deeply public about nothing that did, recognized it with a jolt that he was not entirely prepared for. He stayed for the remainder of the afternoon. They walked the garden, which she showed him with the particular combination of pride and practicality of someone demonstrating a thing they have built entirely themselves. She told him about the espaliered pears and the variety of thyme that came back every year despite the frost, and the late roses, which were her mother's original planting, and which she considered herself merely their custodian rather than their keeper. He listened with the attention he always brought to things that mattered to people, which was the same attention he would have brought to a parliamentary debate or a complex piece of estate accounting, because he had never operated on the assumption that one variety of thing mattered more than another simply on the basis of the category to which the world had assigned it. He asked questions. She answered them. She asked questions in return, which surprised him pleasantly, because most people did not, in his company, presume to do so, and her questions were the questions of a person who has been paying attention. They spoke about the reform work and about the management of land in difficult seasons, and about a particular passage in a book they had apparently both read, which led to a disagreement about the author's intentions that was conducted with the precise, vigorous civility of two people who are enjoying the disagreement rather more than a resolution would allow. He left when the light began to go, which was earlier each day now, winter having made its decision and begun implementing it without sentiment. He shook her hand at the garden gate, which was not conventional for the greeting or departure of a young unmarried woman, but which seemed to both of them in the moment the appropriate gesture. Her hand was warm, still faintly soil-scented, and entirely steady. He walked back to his horse, which had been held by the stable boy near the front of the house, and he did not look back, because he was not a man who looked back when he had made up his mind about the direction he was going. And he had, in the course of a single autumn afternoon in a walled garden smelling of thyme and late roses, made up his mind about the direction he was going with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who has been paying sufficient attention to the evidence long enough that the conclusion, when it arrives not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. What he had not yet accounted for was Helena, and Helena, as it happened, had accounted for him very thoroughly. She had watched from the upper window of the drawing-room as the Duke had departed through the east garden gate and been received his horse by the stable boy and ridden away down the elm avenue with the unhurried confidence of a man who sees no reason to be rushed. She had watched the whole of it with the expression she wore when she was working through an arithmetic whose solution she did not yet fully like, and when the last sound of his horse's hooves on the frozen lane had faded, she had turned from the window with the slow, deliberate movement of a woman arriving at a decision. She sent for Emmeline that evening. Emmeline came to the upstairs sitting room to find Helena alone by the fire, her needlework in her hands but untouched, which was a detail that told Emmeline more than Helena intended, because Helena did not leave her needlework untouched unless the thing occupying her mind was occupying it entirely. She sat across from her stepmother with the composed patience of someone who has been summoned before and knows how to wait for what is coming without the waste of anticipatory dread. Helena spoke with the measured, reasonable voice she used when she was being precise. She spoke about gratitude and propriety and the obligations of a young woman in Emmeline's position, a position she was careful never to name too directly, but which she described with a thoroughness that left nothing ambiguous. She spoke about the Duke's consequence and the unlikelihood of his interest having the character that Emmeline might be disposed to assign to it, given the difference in their situations, which Helena described with the gentle, inexorable persistence of a woman driving a nail very slowly through very hard wood. She spoke, finally, about the plans she had made for Emmeline's future, plans that she had not previously shared, she said, because she had not wished to cause distress, but that were, she felt, given this afternoon's developments, relevant. A Mr. Aldous Pemberton, she said, of Preston in Lancashire. A man of respectable income and solid standing, she said, though not of the first rank. 43 years of age. A widower. He had expressed, through the appropriate channels, an interest in a match, and Helena had, in the quiet management of Emmeline's affairs that Lord Edmondswell had placed in her hands, pursued the discussion to a point that was rather more advanced than the word discussion suggested. The arrangement, Helena said with the pleasant finality of a woman closing a chapter she has been writing for some time, was very nearly settled. Mr. Pemberton expected to visit Hartwell Grange within the fortnight. And it would be, she said, setting her untouched needlework aside at last with a precision that was itself a statement, very much to everyone's advantage if the visit proceeded smoothly, and if Emmeline, in the interim, did not give anyone any reason to consider other arrangements necessary. Emmeline sat across from her stepmother in the firelit room and felt the temperature of the situation with the same accuracy that she had felt the temperature of the stable on the night of the first frost. She felt it in her hands and in her chest, and in the place behind her composure where the things she could not say aloud were kept, and she felt it settle there with the cold and precise weight of a thing that has been confirmed rather than feared for the first time. Mr. Pemberton of Preston, 43, a widower. The word settled was doing the full measure of the work Helena had sent it to do. She said good night to her stepmother with the composure that was, in all the difficult circumstances of her life, the thing she had protected above every other thing, because it was the thing that was entirely hers. She went to her room. She sat at the edge of the narrow bed above the chest that held the folded blue velvet coat, and she looked at the window where the first stars were appearing above the frost-dark Derbyshire fields, small and cold and very far away, and she thought about a garden in the last light of the afternoon and a man who had said, with the complete certainty of someone who does not say things he does not mean, that he was a straightforward one. She thought about what straightforward cost, in a world where the people with the power to arrange things had a very long head start, and a very clear idea of what they intended to arrange. Outside, the night came down on the county in its October way, cold and absolute and certain of itself. And somewhere along the dark lane that led from Hartwell Grange toward Aldenmuir Park, a lantern bobbed in the distance above the road, belonging to someone traveling late, and the frost held the whole still world in its glittering, indifferent grip. Mr. Pemberton never arrived. Julian reviewed the will, found provisions managed more creatively than lawfully, and resolved the matter quietly. Helena left Hartwell Grange before the second frost. The county did not miss her. He asked Emmeline to marry him in the walled garden, beside the espaliered pears, on a morning when the first snow was just beginning. He asked plainly. She answered the same way. They were married in spring, when her mother's roses were beginning again, and everything her father had loved about that particular piece of Derbyshire limestone was exactly as he had left it held, at last, by someone who deserved it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.